上去。
早上就有44例吧，有11例重症，没怎么紧张。
哦，
不像
那
SARS 啊，相当于传染性没有相当于紧张。
那您还是对政府的政策比较放心的是吧？
哎。
So the whole family of coronaviruses are named coronavirus because corona means crown, and so this refers to the way that the virus looks under the microscope, like there's a crown on the top of the virus. Some of them, 4 or 5 different kinds, cause common diseases among humans, everything from the common cold to mild or moderate respiratory illnesses. Other kinds of coronaviruses affect animals. And sometimes, on rare occasions, we see coronaviruses jump from animal species into the human population. 2019 novel coronavirus is getting a lot of attention now because it is a new kind of coronavirus we haven't seen among humans before. The theory is that it may have jumped from an animal species into the human population and then begun spreading.
The Chinese government was widely criticized over attempts to cover up the outbreak in the early weeks, including crackdowns on doctors who tried to warn colleagues about a new SARS-like virus which was emerging in the city of Wuhan in the Hubei province.
Can you talk about your concerns about deaths being misreported by coronavirus because of either lack of testing or standards for how they're characterized?
Someone dies with COVID-19, we are counting that as a COVID-19 death.
Can you be sure? I mean, you hear from coroners that that's not necessarily the case. Are you sure? How can you be confident about that? And is there any concern that it skews the data that you're trying to collect in terms of projections and things like that?
And what's interesting to me too is when someone dies in this country right now, they're not talking about the high blood pressure, the diabetes, the stroke. They say, did they die from COVID? We've been to hundreds of autopsies. You don't talk about one thing. You talk about comorbidities. Their vessels were narrowed. Their lungs were a smoker. COVID was part of it. It is not the reason they died, folks. It is one of many reasons. So to be so simplistic to say that's a COVID death because they have COVID, you know how many people die with pneumonia or people that die from flu? With flu, I should say. It's not from flu. Their lungs were compromised by COPD. They had a heart attack 2 years ago. They have a weakened body. We aren't pressured to test for flu. But ER doctors now, my friends that I talk to say, you know, it's interesting, when I'm writing up my death report, I'm being pressured to add COVID. Why is that? Why are we being pressured to add COVID? To maybe increase the numbers and make it look a little bit worse than it is? I think so.
We also talk about removing information that is problematic. You know, of course, anything that is medically unsubstantiated, so people saying like, take vitamin C, take turmeric, like those all will cure you. Those are the examples of things that would be a violation of our policy. Anything that would go against World Health Organization recommendations would be a violation of our policy. And so remove is another really important part of our policy.
So you're not just putting the truth next to the lie, you're taking the lie down. That's a pretty aggressive approach. So you're not just putting the truth next to the lie, you're taking the lie down. That's a pretty aggressive approach.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Last night on this show, we played you a clip from a nearly hour-long video produced by two physicians in California, Doctors Dan Erickson and Artin Masihi. Likely many of you had already seen it. That video has had more than 5 million views on YouTube. In their presentation, the two doctors presented a flurry of data pointing to what we are currently learning about this virus and how it spreads. They recited pages of government statistics and then interpreted them in light of their own long clinical experience as doctors. At one point, they noted that the newly adjusted death rate in their state of California, which is much lower than anyone expected it to be, and they asked if government officials there should change their policies based on this new science. Watch.
We've tested 5,213 people, and we have 340 positive COVID cases. Well, that's 6.5% of the population, which would indicate that there is a widespread viral infection, similar to flu, which is a 0.1% chance of dying from COVID in the state of New York. And they have a 92% recovery rate. If you are indeed diagnosed with COVID-19, 92% of you will recover. So we're seeing millions of cases, small amount of death. Millions of cases, small amount of death. And the reason I'm making that point is because we're going to compare this to flu and say, is this significantly different from influenza A and B? And if not, why has our response been what it is?
Last night, the doctor's video, the one you just saw, was pulled off of YouTube, the largest video hosting site in the world. It wasn't an accident. YouTube admitted doing it. The company cited a violation of, quote, community guidelines, and they did not apologize. Looking back, when all of this is finally over, and it will be, it's likely that we'll see this moment, what YouTube just did, as a turning point in the way we live in this country, a sharp break with 250 years of law and custom. The two doctors' video was produced by a local television channel in California. It was, in effect, a mainstream news story. The video was not pornographic. It didn't violate copyright or incite violence or commit libel. It didn't break any law. The only justification for taking it down was that the two physicians on screen had reached different conclusions from the people currently in charge. It was a form of dissent from orthodoxy. YouTube and its parent company Google have now officially banned dissent. The CEO of YouTube admitted that openly.
Maybe I'll just start off with stating the obvious. I would have loved to stream this on YouTube to our 2 million subscribers who really want this information. I get stopped in the streets all the time, but we are being censored. And I'm new to this. My work wasn't censored until April 6th of this year. And now I've seen it in a big way. And I'll be honest with you, Andrew, you know, when I was talking about COVID-19 and 5G, I thought it was bad. When I started talking about vaccination, it almost went up 5x. And when I had Robert Kennedy on, basically my YouTube rep said, don't even think about putting that on YouTube.
Medical masks like this one cannot protect against the new coronavirus when used alone. When you wear them, you must combine with hand hygiene and other preventive measures. WHO only recommends the use of masks in specific cases. If you have cough, fever, and difficulty breathing, you should wear a mask and seek medical care. If you do not have these symptoms, you do not have to wear masks, because there is no evidence that they protect people who are not sick. Because there is no evidence that they protect people who are not sick.
But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual. So there's a couple of things in the question that you just asked. One is the number of cases that are reported, that are being reported as asymptomatic. And so we hear from a number of countries that X percentage of them are reported as not having symptoms, or that they are in their pre-symptomatic phase, which means it's a few days before they actually develop severe symptoms. In a number of countries, when we go back and we discuss with them, one, how are these asymptomatic cases being identified? Many of them are being identified through contact tracing. And so, which is what we would want to see, in that you have a known case, You find your contacts, they're already in quarantine, hopefully, and some of them are tested, and then you pick up people who may have asymptomatic or no symptoms or even mild symptoms. The other thing we're finding is that when we actually go back and say how many of them were truly asymptomatic, we find out that many have really mild disease, very mild disease. They're not quote unquote COVID symptoms, meaning they may not have developed fever yet, they may not have had a significant cough, or they may not have shortness of breath, but some may have mild disease. Having said that, we do know that there can be people that are truly asymptomatic and PCR positive. The second part of your question is what proportion of asymptomatic individuals actually transmit. So the way that we look at that is we look at these individuals need to be followed carefully over the course of when they're detected and looking at secondary transmission. We have a number of reports from countries who are doing very detailed contact tracing. They're following asymptomatic cases, they're following contacts, and they're not finding secondary transmission onward. It's very rare. Very rare. And that much of that is not published in the literature. Much of that is not published in the literature. From the papers that are published, there's one that came out from Singapore, looking at a long-term care facility. There are some household transmission studies where you follow individuals over time and you look at the proportion of those that transmit onwards. We are constantly looking at this data, and we're trying to get more information from countries to truly answer this question. It still appears to be rare that an asymptomatic individual actually transmits onward. What we really want to be focused on is following the symptomatic cases. If we followed all of the symptomatic cases, because we know that this is a respiratory pathogen, it passes from an individual through infectious droplets. If we actually followed all of the symptomatic cases, isolated those cases, followed the contacts and quarantined those contacts, we would drastically reduce. I would love to be able to give a proportion of how much transmission we would actually stop, but it would be a drastic reduction in transmission. If we could focus on that, I think we would do very, very well in terms of suppressing transmission. But from the data we have, it still seems to be rare that an asymptomatic person actually transmits onward to a secondary individual.
The WHO remains consistent in stating that the use of a mask alone is insufficient to provide an adequate level of protection or source control. According to the current evidence, transmission mainly occurs in close contact within 1 meter or 3.3 feet of an infected person. Current available evidence from contact tracing reported by WHO member states suggests that asymptomatically infected individuals are much less likely to transmit than those who develop symptoms. Many countries have recommended the use of fabric masks or face coverings for the general public. At the present time, the widespread use of masks by healthy people in the community setting is not yet supported by high quality or direct scientific evidence, and there are potential benefits and harms to consider. Still, at present, there is no direct evidence from studies on COVID-19 and in healthy people in the community on the effectiveness of universal masking of healthy people in the community to prevent infection with respiratory viruses, including COVID-19.
Bill Gates, thank you very much for joining us on BBC Breakfast. I just wonder if I could first ask you, how important is it now to have a global response?
Well, I'd say it's critical because the tools that are going to reduce deaths, the drugs, that's a global thing to get those out. And the thing that'll get us back to the world that we had before coronavirus is the vaccine and getting that out to all 7 billion people. Is the vaccine and getting that out to all 7 billion people. Now here we are, we didn't simulate this, we didn't practice. So both the health policies and economic policies, we find ourselves in uncharted territory.
began in healthy-looking pigs, months, perhaps years ago. A new coronavirus spread silently within herds. Gradually, farmers started getting sick. Infected people got a respiratory illness with symptoms ranging from mild flu-like signs to severe pneumonia. The sickest required intensive care. Many died. Experts agree unless it is quickly controlled, it could lead to a severe pandemic, an outbreak that circles the globe and affects people everywhere.
The mission of the Pandemic Emergency Board is to provide recommendations to deal with the major global challenges arising in response to an unfolding pandemic. The board is comprised of highly experienced leaders from business, public health, and civil society.
We could be looking at double the number of cases in 1 week and 16 times as many in a month if we are not able to stop the spread. That would be on the order of 500,000 cases, and it would continue to rise exponentially. In 3 months, we could be approaching 10 million cases.
Public health agencies have issued travel advisories, while some countries have banned travel from the worst affected areas. As a result, the travel sector is taking a huge hit. Travel bookings are down 45%, and many flights have been canceled. A ripple effect is racing through the service sector. Governments that rely on travel and tourism as a large part of their economies are being hit particularly hard.
How should national leaders, businesses, and international organizations balance the risk of worsening disease that would be caused by the continued movement of people around the world against the risks of profound economic consequence of travel and trade bans?
If there's some sense that there's a UN institution that can do all of this, then I worry we're suffering from a delusional disorder on the power of the UN. It's really important to get those industries and their trade associations and an efficient leadership established, which is decentralized, but has a collective responsibility and accountability. And that needs to be supported by the public leadership.
What is essential, what is non-essential travel, we have to clarify this. Otherwise, if we go down to 20% bookings over a long period, the company will run down. That's a fact.
And that's where a type of public-private collaboration that we have not generally had in these crises needs to be put together pretty quickly.
We are not out of money yet, but the fact is we are trending in a dangerous direction and something needs to change.
So the policy question for this board now is how should financial resources be prioritized? Are there nodes that we cannot allow to fail? What is your sense of priorities? We don't have money to pay for all of these urgent problems.
So at the moment, we want the funds, right? You need the money. So where's the money? So government can supply some money. A lot of, private sectors, some are sitting here, you have some money. But now you need a really coordinated, centralized efforts.
Hotels will be experiencing, crippling losses doing that. And we know that the hotel business in itself makes up 5% of the GDP.
Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or for the most part, it's really a war footing that we need to be on. Governments need to be willing to do things that are out of their historical perspective, or
we shouldn't underestimate the power of entrepreneurship. We need to escalate that, whether it's through the government's helping with tax breaks or subsidies of that nature to increase manufacturing of those types of products. It can happen quickly. A Marshall-type plan, don't mean to say that exactly, but a Marshall Plan. They can go into effect, can stimulate change very quickly.
countries are reacting in different ways as to how best to manage the overwhelming amounts of dis and misinformation circulating over the internet. In some cases, limited internet shutdowns are being implemented to quell panic.
How much control of information should there be, and by whom? And how can false information be effectively challenged? And what if that false information is coming from companies or from governments?
I think it's very important that we make sure that there is concise communication with all healthcare facilities where these patients are being treated so that there isn't mass panic.
We're at a moment where the social media platforms have to step forward and recognize the moment to assert that they're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They're a technology platform and not a broadcaster is over. They, in fact, have to be a participant in broadcasting accurate information and partnering with the scientific and health communities to counterweight, if not flood the zone, of accurate information, because to put the genie back in the bottle of the misinformation and disinformation is nigh impossible.
One thing we haven't spoken about, and I'm wondering whether it's time to talk about this, is a step up from the part of the governments on enforcement actions against fake news. Enforcement actions against fake news.
I personally do not believe that trying to shut things down in terms of information is either practical or desirable. And we do have, I think, a couple of strategies that are available to us, one of which is the flood strategy, second of which is relying and informing and equipping trusted sources of information with the facts so they can then pass that on. But we also need to actually think about a technological answer to this.
Okay, we will now advance 3 weeks to the fourth and final meeting of the Pandemic Emergency Board on December 18th, 2019.
Okay, thank you for reconvening, and let's get an update from Dr. Rivers.
In the last 3 weeks, case numbers have continued to grow exponentially. We now have an estimated 4.2 million cases and 240,000 deaths. Almost every country is now reporting cases, and those who aren't may simply not have the resources to conduct surveillance. We don't see any change in the rate of rapid spread, and models estimate that we could have more than 12 million cases and close to 1 million deaths by mid-January. We're not sure how big this could get, but there's no end in sight. Financial markets are universally down by 15% or more on the year. Fear of a catastrophic pandemic and uncertainty about the capacity for governments to respond and remain viable are fueling investor uncertainty.
We have called this meeting today because of major strategic problems around communication that are happening globally.
I still find it shocking how tough it is and how hard it's going to be to get back to the normal life that we had before.
On that note, and on that note of normal, do you think things will go back to normal, or is that all changed?
No, once you have a safe and effective vaccine and get that out to almost all of the people on the planet, and build the preparatory systems for the next pandemic, so you can nip it in the bud, we will go back to normal and economies will recover. But we have multiple stages to go through in terms of, until we have that, how much can we open up? How do we help the developing countries? But the economy eventually will go back to where it was, and innovation will help us not be at such a risk in the years after that.
Bill Gates, very good to speak to you. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.